Okay, hello, Jarrah. Thank you so much for joining us at the ASA Oral History Project. We have battled tech issues and light rail disasters to get here, and I'm really grateful that you've made the time to speak with us today. Why don't you start just about telling us a bit about who you are, introduce yourself, and maybe perhaps a bit about when and where your path to Asian studies began.
Of course. Thank you very much, Tash. Thanks for putting all this together and all your hard work in documenting the ASAA's history and the role of the association, but also of the people involved in Asian studies in Australia. I think this is a really great opportunity. Speaking as a current executive of the ASAA, I think that we really have a great opportunity here to be sharing a bit of knowledge, learning from each other, and also, I think, having some really interesting discussions about where the future might lie. So thanks very much for all your work in supporting this and also for your hard work for the ASAA in general. So my I guess my path into Asian studies, I suppose it starts with my own cultural background. I'm part Indonesian, part Australian. I spent good section of my early childhood in Indonesia. My sort of kindergarten, primary school years, I grew up in Bali. Subsequently, I moved to Australia, back to Australia where I was born, but continued naturally close relationship with my family in Bali and with Indonesia more generally. And although when I came into uni for undergraduate, I didn't necessarily know or think that I would become an Asian studies scholar or a historian of Asia. I always had that as part of my life. It was something that I pursued to a small degree in early undergraduate while also studying other things, other subjects beyond Asian studies. But it was really after the end of my undergraduate degree when I was looking for something new. I knew that I wanted to pursue more study, I wanted to pursue research, but I wasn't sure how to approach it or where to go. And at that time, I encountered a really great community of Asian studies scholars at the University of Sydney, where I was, particularly a great mentor to me, Professor Adrian Vickers, historian of Indonesia, who I approached at that time, and we discussed possibilities for me to continue study, undertake a master's, and then to go on to do a PhD. And that was when I first began to become engaged in Indonesian history in a formal way.
Mm.
So I began to study the historical texts of Indonesia, the traditional chronicles and genealogies of Bali, of Java, of the Malay world. And very quickly, I realized that this was where my interest was going to lie. So discovering how the peoples of Indonesia, particularly in the pre-modern and early modern periods, so before, I suppose, the consolidation of colonial rule in Indonesia, how they traditionally thought about the past, how they recorded it, how they expressed their knowledge of the past, and how they transmitted it in their traditional documents. So, particularly traditional manuscripts, inscriptions, oral traditions. So, from this period of postgraduate study, my master's and my PhD at the University of Sydney, I became sort of introduced to this field of study of traditional or early Indonesian history. And that was really my starting point. So I've continued to focus my research in that area, broadening in various ways, looking at other issues, but still very much sort of focused or interested in those questions of the development of history in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia more broadly, how we can understand history as a set of sort of practices that are embedded in a particular society or in a particular culture, rather than just a sort of uh, pure science that we impose upon Asian materials, or an approach that we seek to extract information from in this sort of systematic way, understanding that people in Asia have long practiced history, perhaps longer than other parts of the world, and that we need to take those approaches to doing history seriously and understand them for what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, what a trajectory. And I totally agree with what you say. You mentioned Adrian Vickers as like a influential figure early on. And I just wonder, was there something particular about him, or what was it that was influential for you? And also, was the PhD something you always had in mind when you decided to do further study?
The PhD was something that I had always had in mind.
Mm.
So I sort of, it was from an early stage in my life, I had a strong feeling that that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of do long-term deep research on a topic. I wasn't sure what that was going to be necessarily. I wasn't at the time even committed to history as a discipline, uh, and certainly not to pre-modern history. There were times when I thought maybe I would pursue a more modern period. Aspects of 20th century history were also interesting to me, but in the end, I settled on this pre-modern topic, and that was one of the influences that Adrian had on me. That he encouraged me to pursue that part of history, due to the fact that I had studied some classical languages earlier in my undergraduate, or even earlier in my education, that I had an interest in texts, that I had an interest in language and literature. And so approaching history through that textual avenue was something which made a lot of sense for me personally, given my background. And it was also a really good match then for Adrian, as a supervisor and mentor, because he had developed through his own career an approach to history in which the textual element was inseparable from the historical inquiry. So his early works had been very much focused on traditional literature, but his approach towards it saw how history could be shaped by and constituted almost by the way in which texts were produced, the way in which discourses were developed. And he sort of exemplified this practice in a number of his works. Important texts like Bali, A Paradise Created, or History of Modern Indonesia, both well-known works by Adrian, which have a historical question or a set of historical questions which they pursue, but their manner of engaging with those questions is through the cultural products. So Adrian also goes beyond merely texts to look at a wide range of cultural approaches, including visual arts, other kinds of cultural production, in order to understand how that historical knowledge and that historical engagement is realized in different contexts. So that element of the approach was something which resonated a lot with me and made sense with the materials I was working with. So I had a sort of an example to follow. And as always, though, as you continue along a sort of mentor-mentee relationship, you end up discovering a lot uh, more and more about sort of what you can learn from a teacher like that, and then also gradually developing my own perspective, my own approach to similar materials. And what I've found really beneficial was uh, the manner in which Adrian and I have been able to develop and continue to this day, even many, almost 10 years after, or more than 10 years after we began to work formally together. We continue to have this sort of collaborative relationship, and one in which uh, I have been able, thanks to his support, thanks to his encouragement and advice, to develop a strong sense of the way that I approach these kinds of questions. So the manner in which he has supervised me and has supervised other students is one which is very much about building my capacity to chart my own course, which was something that was particularly beneficial to me. It suited my personality and it provided, in my case, just the right amount of balance between structure and guidance, but also a relatively long leash as a PhD student to explore my own ways of doing things, exploring as well relationships with other scholars who had different approaches. So I was able to sort of draw on and synthesize a variety of different ways of approaching history. Adrian's sort of way, other scholars' sort of way, so other mentors as well who were welcomed into my sort of development as a scholar early on and even to this day. So I suppose the two most valuable things that I've discussed are one, his role as a sort of example, as a sort of someone who has shown how one can approach history through the study of cultural products, particularly texts, and also as an example of a scholar who can both train, develop, and encourage younger or more emerging colleagues, while at the same time also providing a sort of degree of support and independence such that those emerging colleagues can build their own approaches, their own agendas. And so that those two elements were really what was sort of crucial to my development from the early part of my career.
That's wonderful and sounds like such a good mentor to have had in those early years. I mean, you talk about this experience of learning how to chart your own path and being given a relatively long leash to do so. And I wonder if you could take us back a little bit to that time and to your like initial forays into research in Asian studies, whether that's the master's or the PhD or another project. And tell us a bit about how you went about it and what skills and knowledge you gained or needed to complete it.
The kind of project that I ended up choosing to do was one which was fairly specialist in the context of Asian studies in Australia in 2015, which is when I started my master's. It was a close study of traditional chronicles in Old Javanese, Balinese, and classical Malay. Most of the original manuscripts were kept outside of Australia, many of them in Indonesia or in the Netherlands and in Britain. It was something which, at the time, Australia had only a handful of scholars, many of them in the later part of their career, who were actively engaged with. So, from the beginning, it was a situation where I was not immediately within a pre-existing research community. Certainly, my specialism was not one which was strongly established anywhere in Australia. Really, it was through my own set of interests, their compatibility with those of Adrian, and also an important supporting supervisor that I also had at Sydney University, Emeritus Professor Peter Worsley, who had previously been the chair of Indonesian Studies at the University of Sydney, and whose specialty was also this study of classical traditional Balinese and Japanese materials. So I had a few key people, but not yet a set of peers or colleagues in my area. So in order to gain the skills necessary, I had to go out of Australia. Particularly, there was this wonderful opportunity that emerged at the same time, which was a intensive course in Old Javanese. So this is the language of Java in up to the 15th century, which is no longer spoken in that archaic form. but it's the language in which a huge number of the documents from that period are written, and also a large number of manuscripts from later, particularly from Bali. So it's an important regional language of Indonesia, but one which is no longer spoken and therefore is a sort of classical language that requires special training. You can't simply learn it by speaking. So there was this intensive training course that was run in Indonesia. It was a collaboration between the National Library of Indonesia and the what's called in English the French School of Asian Studies, the two organizations that had been most active in this research on traditional Indonesian manuscripts, particularly those of Java. So through this collaboration, they were able to put together this sort of intensive 2-week course, which was open to people like me, students, researchers, people who had an interest in studying Old Javanese for research purposes. And by attending this, I became immediately connected to this wonderful community of scholars, both Indonesian and European, who were involved in this. So I found the community that I had not yet had in Australia, this group of people who were interested in the kinds of manuscripts I was interested in, the kind of inscriptions, the kind of history. And what we did together was learn the language, so develop the skills for accessing that knowledge and information. So I was extremely lucky that that was in place at exactly the right time for me. And in the end, those relationships helped me and continue to help me throughout my career. I can, maintain very close collaborations with many of the people who I met at that very first event in 2015, and that's formed a sort of a strong basis on which I can continue to develop my own research agenda and also draw on the expertise and the knowledge and the experience of other colleagues. So that was done outside the Australian context. In a previous generation, or maybe two previous generations, those opportunities would probably have been available in Australia. So there have been times when Old Javanese, modern Javanese, Balinese, the regional languages of Indonesia were taught actively in Australian universities. And that's clearly not the case anymore. Even Indonesian itself, as many of us know, is in danger at many campuses across the country. So this is naturally a huge problem, not just for me, but for Australia in general, and specifically for Australia's capacity to generate knowledge about and with Asia, because the role of language, and not just spoken language, but written language, and not just modern languages, but ancient languages, is very much not on the radar of many decision makers. So my need to go outside of Australia, to go to Indonesia to discover these things, was symptomatic of a broader issue that we, within the Australian system, cannot provide that training at this time. So there's, I guess, two ways of looking at it. The more positive way is that those functions are now being transferred to Asia. That is, if you want to learn about ancient Indonesian history, the place to do it is now Indonesia. If you want to learn about China, classical Chinese, there are many more opportunities in China to do that now than there may be in Australia, etc., etc. So in a way, one can say that this is about Asian societies and Asian communities taking back or building the institutions of knowledge production. But I think that that is not the full story, and it's not as positive as all that. There is undeniably a need for these things to also be institutionalized in Australia and other parts of the world. The study of these issues, the study of these fields, the skills required to conduct them are things which thrive best through a diverse set of institutions that are internationally connected. They don't thrive when they're monopolized by only a handful of institutions and a handful of figures, whether those people happen to be in the country or happen to be overseas. Neither is an ideal situation, right? You don't want to have all the knowledge being controlled from ex-colonial metropolitan centers in Europe. Neither do you want that knowledge to be inaccessible to anyone who's not embedded within the country, right? So my story of having to, and thankfully having had the opportunities to really be trained and continue my training through this network of different organizations, Australian ones, Indonesian ones, European ones, supported by funding arrangements, naturally, both Indonesian government funding, but also then European funding, my own funding as an Australian PhD student coming from the Australian government. So the strings, the funding flows made it all possible. So how do we think about that in the future, right? How do we think about, well, if we have a funding problem in this part of the system, what does that mean for the other part of the system? Can we assume that someone's going to pick up the slack? Probably not. It only works when you've got all of these institutions sort of both adequately supported and then adequately supporting each other. Yeah. And so I believe that, and I certainly aim to build a situation in which people could follow in my footsteps if they want to do something similar to me in Australia. And thankfully, these institutions in Indonesia are still on board. Me and my colleagues are still active, so we can put these things in place, but they are precarious. Mm-hmm. And the precarity is at the moment largely coming from the Australian side, although I have to say is also things are a little bit worrying in Indonesia too at times, in terms of scholarship funding, in terms of research institution funding, etc. So we have to be vigilant, and I'm hopeful that through this particular oral history project, but also the bigger conversations that we're having at the ASAA, we can think about ways of building these sort of pathways, pipelines, whatever metaphor you want to use, because they take effort to build, and once they are threatened or break down, then it can be hard to revive them. Yeah. So I hope that we can sort of discuss some of those as well.
Exactly. I totally agree. And yeah, let's discuss that now. And I guess like one of a good place to start, I think, with that discussion would be to ask you a little bit about the role that you're currently in at the ANU, and whether there are connections to what you say about language learning that you experienced as a PhD student to the role you have at the ANU now and what you're teaching. And so I guess the question is, how does Asia and Asian studies feature into your current role?
So I'm currently a lecturer at the ANU, Australian National University. My role is in the School of Culture, History and Language within the College of Asia and the Pacific. So for those who are not so familiar with the ANU structure, we have this college system largely equivalent to faculties, but we have this college which is specifically dedicated to Asia and the Pacific. So Asian studies is institutionalized here in a way that is unusual for universities in Australia. Generally, very often Asian studies is integrated into faculties of arts and social sciences. Not exclusively, of course, we have people who work on Asian studies beyond those disciplines and in the hard sciences, for example, or in law, etc. But by and large, in the ANU, therefore, I teach Indonesian. That's my primary teaching role. So me and another colleague are responsible for the Indonesian language program here. So we deliver for Indonesian language content. We provide Indonesian language training that is standard modern Indonesian, not the regional languages, the ancient languages that I was talking about earlier. We don't have capacity to teach or deliver those or to offer those subjects. So that's my primary teaching role. And then in addition to that, then I have a research role, and that is within the um, history discipline, Pacific and Asian history. So my research output is focused on the history of Indonesia and slightly more broadly aspects of the history of Southeast Asia. So I kind of balance those two roles, but I see them very much as complementary and essential. Pretty clear why, because that's how I got into history in the first place also, was through literature and language. And I view for our students here that with the language comes access to all of this potential knowledge, and that the disciplinary training that students can bring from their other subjects in their degrees, their other interests, can be then engaged with through the Indonesian context if language is in place, so if the Indonesian language is accessible. So the way I see it, we have certainly moved on from what we might call the sort of the area studies model. And this is something which has been pointed out in the ASAA report, authored by former president and secretary, or actually two former presidents now, Ed Aspinall and Melissa Crouch, in 2022. They observed, or they found in their survey and analysis of Asian studies in Australia, that more and more Asian studies learning, Asian studies research was happening outside of the traditional model of undergraduate students taking a complete set of Asian studies subjects full time. Yeah. So a situation where previously it would have been more normal for students to take Indonesian, Japanese, or Indonesian, Javanese politics subjects and society subjects. Now, students are increasingly taking mainstream disciplinary subjects such as international relations, history, or arts in general, actually, law, politics and society, science and engineering, and adding language into that. That's my experience with my students. We have a small number who are doing sort of the traditional Asian studies bachelor, which we offer, but a majority who are taking subjects, often double degrees, which are very popular here at the ANU, and adding Indonesian as a major or a minor within that degree structure. And what that allows is for students to bring in their disciplinary training. They can learn things, say in law or in international relations, about the world from a disciplinary lens, and then think about how they could use their Indonesian language skills to pursue that learning in the Indonesian context. So that might be going to Indonesia, perhaps on a New Colombo plan mobility grant or scholarship, and doing a course on international relations, but within an Indonesian context. Or it might be applying their medical science training to study the healthcare system in Indonesia, using their language to be able to access sources that otherwise would be unavailable to someone who didn't speak Indonesian. Yeah. So I see that as a positive trend. Yeah. Again, with a reservation. It's positive that students have these abilities to build synergies between their disciplinary studies and language. It's negative because it means that languages are getting crowded out. So languages take a long time to learn. They're time consuming. They can be difficult. They can also be incredibly rewarding, but it's hard to shove it in the spaces or the gaps in an otherwise already very crowded degree. And an issue that many of our students face here is the pressure of having to get this language done within a very constrained set of choices for balancing their studies. And as a result, what we're having to do is try to cover, in a way, the holistic or broad-based cultural, social, historical education that would previously have been spread out over a whole degree into a relatively tight major. So that means that our content is also packed. We ask quite a lot of our students. We expect them to learn the language. We expect them to be able to learn to speak. We expect them to be able to understand grammar and be able to read complex texts. And then also to learn about the history, culture, society, geography, landscape, environment of Indonesia. And this goes for all the other Asian languages and Asian studies that we teach here as well. So there's a lot to do, and I somewhat constrained, or somewhat it's challenging in an environment where it's very difficult to maintain a diversity of units of study to offer.
Mm.
So, as in many universities in Australia, we're under pressure to reduce the number of classes that we offer students. We're under pressure not to offer classes that don't get high enrollments, specialist classes. And those are pressures that ultimately stem from staffing constraints, primarily.
Yeah.
That universities are not budgeting, will not or cannot, we're not sure, budget for adequate staffing to provide for a wide variety of units of study on offer. And students are increasingly being pushed into degrees that are very packed and with quite limited ability to pick
Mhm.
a wide variety of subjects, particularly subjects with small enrollments, with specialist topics, because it's seen to be costly to the universities to offer those and to provide those opportunities. So within those constraints, then, we're having to pack more and more into less and less time, less and less degree space, and students and staff are feeling the pressure of that, right? So, students are having to work harder, I think, than they used to, putting aside the fact that they also have to be employed more and more in order to be able to afford to live in a place like Canberra and the major cities.
Yeah.
So the conditions for learning are rather tight and constricted. So we're doing the best that we can within that, but it has to be acknowledged that in order for Asian studies to really thrive, and not necessarily on the old model. So I think that it's not about going back to the old form of Asian studies necessarily. We can validly observe that there are limitations of the current situation and instead think, okay, well, how could we imagine a better future? It doesn't have to follow the old model, but it should address these concerns that we currently have about the difficulties for students to receive a breadth of Asian studies education and expertise within their degrees, given all the constraints that we've talked about.
Exactly. And that's such a really rich description of like such an evolving field that we're currently in and the really complex needs of the field and the way that it's changing. And I guess it raises the question for me, like, where does the ASAA come into this? So it's perhaps a good time to introduce your involvement with the ASAA. You're a long-standing member, you've been on the executive for many years, you've been the treasurer for the ASAA for a long time. Um, what role do you see the ASAA playing in the changing field that we're in? And in particular, I guess I'm tempted to ask a somewhat provocative question, which is, do we have an identity crisis as an organization if we are somewhat playing by the old model of area studies?
Great questions. The ASAA is an organization of primarily academics, not only, but primarily academics working in the Australian sector on Asia. That already has a couple of important features. One, it's a national organization. Two, it spans all Asian studies. It, Asian studies understood in the Australian context, which notably rarely includes West Asia in its definition, rarely, sometimes it does. But the way that Australia sees Asian studies is South, Southeast, and East Asia. And that's something to think about, whether there is, a sort of a place for engaging more with, for example, Arab studies departments, people who study the Middle East, an area which is of, or Islamic studies, something which is sometimes not fully engaged with by Australian Asian studies in particular. But the resource that we have is that we are a group of academics, and therefore we're not dependent on institutions in the same way. It's quite rare, actually, to find an organization that has the level of independence that we have. We're not financially dependent on anybody. We're not housed in any university. We're not connected to or founded by or sort of institutionally linked to the government. So we have a level of institutional independence that is really important and that we should cherish and make good use of, because we are able to do our activities within our means, within our financial means, within our sort of the remit of our constitution, but we're self-determining. And our members are the ones who determine what direction we go in. We're responsible to our members at our AGM. We're responsible to them through delegation, through the ASAA Council, through the election of councillors and executives. So we are a community. And the ASAA's role is, I think, fundamentally, primarily, before anything else, is to nurture that community. I think that was the vision that was present when the ASAA was founded in the 70s, and the people who were kind of key figures in that, getting together. And also we've heard some stories about that, both from members who are no longer with us, but also from some of those who were present at those times and remember them, how it was a sort of visionary thing, but the way that I understand, or the way I've heard the story, sort of planned around the sort of the at the cafe, right? Like around the meeting table. It's like, okay, what can we do? How can we figure this out? And the fact that it has continued to thrive for 50 years is a remarkable thing. Because we are a self-determining organization, then we're able to call the shots a little bit about what we see the future of Asian studies to be in a way that would not be possible if we were dependent on universities and their agendas, not be possible if we were dependent on government and their agenda, or business and their agendas. So I think our key is to figure out what our agenda is.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of discussions, and we continue to have discussions about the state of the field, our regular reports on the state of the field, 2022 being the most recent one, but going back the decades previously as well. We have, I mean, that's an important task that we serve, to keep watch of the state of the field, to account for it and say what's happening, why is it happening. We have a role in advocacy for sure, and we have done so in various instances to varying degrees of success, arguing for or against specific policies, proposals that come out of government or that come out of universities, defending as much as we can the interests of our members, particularly those who are threatened by budget cuts, by policy changes, etc. Standing up for academic freedom is a really important one. So there are instances where the ASAA has had to argue for and take a stand against attempts to limit the freedom of academics to research, to write, to speak on certain topics within Asian studies. That is a role which the ASAA has must, and will continue to maintain strongly, because again, we're independent, we're able to do so. The question is, how much influence can and do we have? So I think that a role for us, and this is my own view, but I think it's a view that's broadly shared by the ASAA's councillors and executive. It's something which is also sort of in progress, and so that there are things afoot. which aren't yet sort of public knowledge, but there are approaches that we can take towards building our influence, attempting to be strategic, finding out ways of connecting with potential allies and supporters. One of the sort of the features of Asian studies or the Asian engagement in Australia is there's a lot of talk.
Mm.
Australians love to talk about Asia. They love to talk about how important it is. It's our biggest, it's our region, Indonesia's biggest neighbor, all these things, right? A lot of theoretical goodwill and often much less practical investment, engagement, institution building, and practical realization of those aspirations. So we have a role to play in sort of, again, watching those processes, advocating where we can, holding people to account to what they say. But it has to be an approach of coalition building and alliance building, right? We continue to have to connect with institutions that are sympathetic, engage with institutions that are perhaps neutral or to be persuaded, uh, and figure out ways of connecting with them without losing our identity. So, yeah, identity crisis. Do we have one? The answer is, I think it's basically no. What I think we have is potentially a um, concerns about our membership base and understanding our members. That is, we have what I think is a fairly robust core membership of a couple of hundred members. And then we have a sort of, this is my perspective as treasurer, a sort of penumbra of members who are, in theory, on board, or they may be interested in specific things the ASA does. They may want to come to the conference. And so they're participants and they gain membership. But otherwise their engagement with the ASAA is relatively casual. And that's in theory, in general, there's nothing wrong with that gradation of engagement. But it's a long-term concern if the core membership shrinks, which is what we're seeing slowly happening. So we're seeing a sort of the kind of the core engaged membership is reducing, and that's also a reflection of the situation whereby Asian studies as a university, as part of the university sector, is diminishing also. There's fewer and fewer jobs in Asian studies, but at the same time, I think it's also perhaps a consequence of this, partly a consequence of this moving away from the area studies model. That is, there's more greater and greater proportion of people who might not traditionally consider themselves to be Asianists because they might be in disciplines where that's not really a well-known identity, as it might be in the humanities or social sciences, where we have a strong tradition of identifying as an Asianist and Indonesianist within our disciplines. But maybe in other disciplines, that's not so clear, not such traditional, conventional identity. And so those people might not necessarily see themselves as an Asianist belonging to the ASAA. So I think we've got some work to do in thinking about how to engage with such potential members and communities. So when we think about, well, what's our identity? It's got to be constituted by our members. Who are our members? That's something that we also need to really think about and figure out ways of engaging, because my view is that the ASAA already has a lot of strength as an organization from its membership base. We have a large membership base by contrast to other Asian studies associations, except naturally the US one, AAS, which is extremely large. So we've got resources, and the question is, how do we make sure that they stay sustainable, and how do we continue to reflect the needs and values of our membership? And I think that my personal view is that this is where what the task that faces us now is reaching out to that membership, extending it, growing it, connecting with, for example, students, even undergraduate students who are thinking about Asian studies, potentially doing, research, PhDs, possibly wanting to engage in the field, providing them with structure and encouragement and support, because it's necessary. It's necessary to actively build that community, because it's fair to say that not many institutions in Australia are actively building that Asian studies community.
Yeah, totally. It's such a motivating call to arms every time I speak to you about these topics. I think you're so right about your perspective here. And I think you spoke so well about the challenges that we face, like in the field, and what the ASAA is trying to do. And I guess like a question that I have is like, what are the strengths that you see of for the field or for the ASAA at the moment? So like, what are the topics or subfields that you're excited about, or is there a particular initiative that excites you as well?
I think that we have a an important group of postgraduates coming through. Uh, we have the capacity to support them, which is necessary because it's difficult to be a postgraduate student in Australia, whether you're domestic or international. So we have an opportunity to provide ongoing continued support to uh, those newer members of our community, whether it's through support for the ASAA conference every 2 years, whether it's support through mentoring schemes and other kinds of more community-oriented approaches. We talked earlier on about the importance of mentorship. So whether the ASA can facilitate some of those relationships, I think is a really fruitful avenue. We're also very proud of our journal,
Mm.
the Asian Studies Review. This is a journal which has been around for a long time and is increasingly becoming a sort of key reference point in the field. We're publishing some wonderful material. It's really important that we have a journal, that we have a scholarly voice as an organization. And so another way of looking at what ASA represents is through its journal, the kinds of articles that we publish, the kinds of conversations that those articles are contributing to. Because we're ultimately, an intellectual organization as well, right? We have to be contributing to a wide range of scholarly discussions and debates and agendas. So the journal itself continues to be an important source of material support for the ASAA revenue, but more importantly, it's a way by which we can also shape the intellectual agenda. And so thinking about Australia's role in broader Asian studies is also important. So we're in Australia, we are actually in a fortunate position that we're so close to Asia that we have sort of natural resources to draw on in terms of the ability of Asian students to come study here, the proximity, the ease with which we can go to Asia, which is very different to our colleagues in the US, for example, in America or in Europe, other Western countries. So we have those things sort of at our fingertips, but I think that we can also fruitfully engage more with the other learned societies and the organizations such as AAS in the US, such as EuroCs in Europe or ICAS more broadly. Um, all of these things take work and effort, right? And we the executive of volunteers, counselors volunteer their work. So another important thing is talking about the strictures that I discussed before, is to think about how the ASAA can broaden participation,
Yeah.
something which I've certainly been thinking about as treasurer. How can we get more people within the ASAA on board with some of these projects? Because we don't want to be a small team endeavor necessarily. I think we're stronger and we're more effective when we bring in a broader group of members. Not everybody, has to do everything, but by building those relationships that we already have and the networks that we already access to through the existing ASA membership, I think we can do a lot to build the field more broadly. And we are in a good position, I think, whether you want to use the word mediate, whether you want to use the word connect, whatever the framing of it is, to engage with both Asian studies as it's developing in Asia and Asian studies as it continues to develop outside of Asia. We are both out of Asia and in Asia. This is sort of constant paradox of Australian identity.
Yeah,
And therefore, we have an opportunity to engage with both sides. And I think that we have a responsibility to do so as well. So I think those are my main sort of, I guess, hopes. Building our community, particularly our emerging scholars, maintaining our intellectual identity through publication, the journal, and the things around it, like Asian currents and the dissemination of that knowledge and research, the book prizes, etc. And thirdly, yeah, these institutional relationships and links. And I think that again, that's ambitious to do all of those things. It's a lot of work to do all those things. And so thinking about how do we manage that work as an organization is also really important strategically.
totally. That's so wonderful. Jarrah, like you give so much to the ASAA in terms of like your time and energy. And so I really want to end giving you a chance to platform yourself. So I wondered if you could just finish by telling us a bit about a particular book or article or other publication that you're particularly proud of, and why.
I'm going to plug my new book, which is coming out, my first book, which will be coming out next year. It's called The Precarious Past, Shaping Historical Practices in Pre-Modern Java. This is a project I worked on for a long time, many years. It is grounded in the sorts of things that I was talking about earlier, looking at history as a set of practices through texts, through cultural practices. How did the Javanese or people in Java and Bali approach history? How do they practice history? How do they understand the past, analyze it, transmit knowledge about it? And what is really core about the research that I did for this book and the argument that I make in the book is that people approach the past in really different ways. That's a fact that we can easily see as soon as we look with any care at the way that people in Asia, people in Africa, people in America and South America, other parts of the world engage with the past, we see that's really diverse and really different, and things that we would not expect, things which we might not approve of, even of how people talk about evidence and make claims and arguments about the past. All of those things happen in reality in different societies and different communities. So, what I'm trying to do in the book is to approach the question of, well, why is that the case? Rather than judging it as good or bad, trying to explain what the reasons behind these differences are. Why don't we all do it the same way? And what I found by focusing on the Indonesian materials was that it was to do with how texts are transmitted, and not just written texts, but also oral traditions, physical memorials, performance traditions, these different ways of transmitting information about the past all have their own contexts. And in Java, for example, the texts don't last very long in the tropical climate. That if you compare it to medieval Europe or China, manuscripts just don't physically last as long, anywhere near. So that has a huge impact on how you do history. If you don't have access to the old manuscripts or the old sources, if you have to keep copying them over and over and over again, otherwise they disappear, then you're going to respond differently to knowledge about the past. You're going to rely on different kinds of knowledge. You're going to rely on different ways of keeping memories alive than simply archives in the traditional, conventional sense of a room full of documents that just sit there for a long time. So I was really curious about these sorts of practices. Well, what is it? What are the implications then? If we have all these different situations, then how do people respond differently and do history differently? So that's the question that I ask in the book, and it'll be coming out, yep, in the second half of next year, um, if everything goes well. And it's published by the University of California Press, and it will also be available open access in ebook form. So, what I really hope, because we know how prohibitively expensive academic books can be, um, I've been able, with the support of colleagues and institutions behind them, to make a version of the book available online. So I'm very hopeful that that level of access will benefit specifically Indonesian communities, but also those more broadly who are interested in the practice of history. So that's my that's my self-promotion. And thanks very much for your time as well in organizing all this and for providing a platform for these discussions. Because as you have said, this is a sort of opportunity for us all to consider how we are as a community, what we want, what our values are, and the best way that we can do that is through these ongoing discussions and sharing our points of view. So I wanted to thank you as well, Tash, for making the time and putting the effort into organizing all of this.
Absolutely. And thank you too for being involved. Congratulations on the book. And it really strikes me that even in getting your own book out there in the world, you're still thinking about others and how you can make it accessible. And it's really special. So yeah, thank you so much again. We'll leave it there. Looking forward to continuing the conversation in other platforms.
Thank you very much.